The Montreal that I'm going to talk about is in Sevenoaks in Kent. To the east is Kippington, another Repton landscape, and further east lies Knowle, which, despite appearing in Peacock's polite repository, is probably not a Repton landscape. The three Amherst brothers returned from military campaigns in North America at the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, 2 generals and an admiral. They raised an obelisk at Montreal, which remains today as a war memorial. In 1769, Geoffrey Amherst, the eldest brother and commander of the British forces in North America, built a house at Montreal named for his victory over the French. At the same time, his younger brother, William, built a house near Ryde in the Isle of Wight, St. John's, and that commemorated the capture of St. John's in Newfoundland. William died in 1781, leaving his 8-year-old son, William Pitt Amherst, to inherit. He was brought up at St. John's, but 15 years later, he sold it because it was clear that he was going to inherit Montreal from his uncle. He sold St. John's to Edmund Simeon, who called in Humphry Repton in 1797, who suggested various changes to the landscape, as well as the marina, you can see, and tucked in the trees is the lodge. The house remains today as a school, but you can see house, pleasure garden, and fence separating the pleasure garden from the park. In the same year that Repton visited St. John's, William Pitt Amherst's uncle, Geoffrey, the victor of Montreal, died. He had no children, and William therefore inherited Montreal. He was 24 years old. 3 years later, in 1800, William married Sarah Archer, widow of Other Windsor, 5th Earl of Plymouth, by whom she had had 3 children. And children arrived to William and Sarah in quick succession. First Sarah Elizabeth, and then Geoffrey. Next door to Montreal was the estate of Kippington, as we showed you on the map. And in 1808, Humphry Repton visited Kippington, the home of Francis Austin, a cousin of Jane Austen. And here, Repton produced a manuscript report, but no red book. It was not left lying about on the library table, but was acted on straight away, and changes were made. The changes to the approach drive to the house, the planting of flower beds around the house with walks for the ladies. By 1811, Lord Amherst decided it was time for Humphry Repton to visit Montreal. Thus it was that only a few months after his accident, Repton arrived at Montreal, and here he did produce a red book, except it wasn't a red book, it was a green book, and it is now in the National Archives in Ottawa. Repton arrived to find the house looking like this, apparently 2 stories. But in fact, it was 3. And you can see that the whole way round the house was a ravine, and the reason for this was that it allowed light into the basement. But the only way in and out of the house was across the ravine at the south side. The first thing that Repton did was to go through the house to the saloon, and he looked out at the main view of the North Downs. Delightful scenery. The second thing he did was to notice the flower beds immediately in front of him under the saloon, which offered much beauty. And the third thing he did was to ask how he could get into the flower garden. Answer: you have to go back through the house, out of the front door, all the way round 200 yards. Clearly a problem. This is the first image in Repton's Red Book, which shows the house from the north. And as you can see, the house is placed on the top of a slope which leads down to 4 small lakes. And at the bottom of the sketch is an inscription: to the Honourable Mr. Amherst. This sketch, taken in his presence from his own little garden, is inscribed in remembrance of the extraordinary interest he appeared to have at so early an age in the improvements suggested by H. Repton. Geoffrey, the little boy, was 8, and Sarah Elizabeth was 11. And my guess is that the driving force in the garden was Sarah Elizabeth. Now, this is Repton's map and containing his proposals. The main entrance to the house he shows on the south side of the building, and this tongue of land going down to the lake. If we enlarge it, what he proposed was an entrance across the ravine which went to an east-west running terrace, which was separated from the park by a balustrade, preferably, he hoped, of stone. And Repton was very keen on this terrace because he discussed the matter with the Prince Regent some years earlier, and he considered it should be an object of taste. And here, the purpose of the terrace and the balustrade was to create a barrier between the house and the park. There was no point in having cattle in the garden, and a ha-ha wouldn't do. Pleasure gardens would lead down the slope to the lake, and they would be a series of small different gardens, a thornery, an evergreen garden, aquatic areas, and wild gardens. And he described these as episodes to the great lawn. And they would all be separated from the park by a wire fence. By the lake would be a pheasantry and a conservatory in the West Passage. A conservatory in the West Passage. Now, on the left, he did propose an enclosed garden here with a water feature as well as a grape house. He also wished to create a veranda on the west wall as another means of crossing the ravine. As he said, there can never be too many escapes from the house. And above all, he wished to change the approach to the house on the south side. But these ideas don't seem to have been too popular, because he had to send a letter of apology to Lord Amherst following his report. As an excuse for my apparent presumption in proposing further improvements to a place nearly as perfect as Montreal, he must avoid the possibility of being afterwards told that he had omitted suggesting great and obvious improvements. So what happened as a result of Repton's proposals? And the answer is nothing at the time. For the next 18 years, the family weren't at Montreal for any length of time. Lord Amherst was ambassador in China, 1816 to 17, where he distinguished himself by refusing to kowtow to the emperor, so he left rather in disgrace. But he then was made Governor General of India, and here he almost started a war during the annexation of Burma, which nearly ended in disaster. And it sounds as though he should have been relieved of his post. But instead, he was given an even grander title, and the family returned home to England. But not before a tragedy had befallen the family when Geoffrey, the little boy who had been 8 at the time of Repton's visit, died in 1826. The ladies in the family were rather more successful in their visit. Sarah, Lady Amherst, returned with her pheasant, Chrysophilus amherstia, and she and Sarah Elizabeth had the Burmese tree orchid, Amherstia nobilis, named after them. This illustration, published in 1830, just after their return. And it's worth just quoting a dictionary of botanists saying that Sarah Elizabeth and her mother were zealous friends and constant promoters of all branches of natural history, especially botany. Now, apart from botany, the ladies were great diarists of sketches. The results were passed round the family to keep everyone informed of what they were doing. And if they'd been alive today, they would never have been off their mobile phones. Everything was discussed. But what was bothering them most was when they got back to England in 1828, Montreal was not big enough for the grown-up family. William Atkinson, an architect, was called in, and everybody in the family chipped in with ideas, but no satisfactory solution was found. So the family made a model of the house and made blocks of wood so that they could move them round and see what it would look like. And the ideas were converted into drawings by Sarah Elizabeth's half-sister Mary, who by now was Marchioness of Downshire and mother of 5 children, and clearly a very capable draftswoman. Eventually, the family left poor Mr. Atkinson, the architect, in peace to get on with the work, not just to the house, but to the garden. They went off on a prolonged tour of England, Wales, and Ireland, which started with staying 3 nights at Windsor Castle with George IV to view his alterations there. Sarah Elizabeth was a talented watercolourist and had been taught to draw by Peter de Wint. These are some of her designs for flower beds at Montreal, and included with them in her archive at Claydon Park are designs for lace that are very similar. The family returned to Montreal in October of 1829 to discover a new house and a new garden. And luckily we know what they looked like because this estate map was drawn 4 years later. The house has been enlarged to east and west over the ravine, and an exit has been made from the saloon to the north to the terrace running east and west, complete with stone balustrade, all as Repton had recommended. The pleasure gardens had been created not to the northwest, but to the northeast, and the planting with their separate beds as interpreted by Sarah Elizabeth. And the reason that they went that way is there was more space and the ground was more level. The pheasants had to live somewhere, and up at the top is their enclosure. Most of the pleasure ground is surrounded by fence, but between the park and the main lawn is a ha-ha. So you would have had the continuous vista across. So family enthusiasm and memories of Repton, together with a red book in the library, finally produced something that Repton would have recognized: a garden with terrace and flower beds by the house, flower beds divided into compartments and carefully separated from the park beyond. This is Repton's after view of the first image I showed you, which again shows the pleasure gardens, the terrace, and the balustrade. And this, in fact, is a photograph of the house taken sometime later in the 19th century, showing the extra bay on each side, and it shows the pleasure garden and the terrace and the stone balustrade, all as Repton had suggested. And Mr. Atkinson did build a conservatory in the West Passage. You can just see it. And it had a very complicated heating system, but the plans for that still survive. The Amhersts did not change the approach to the house from the south, as Repton had proposed. They did not make any changes to the lakes. Neither did they build the water feature or the veranda. But then Repton had never been asked to propose these features. And this is how Sarah Elizabeth saw the park 3 years after they returned in 1833. This is from the southwest, from a similar viewpoint as the first print we showed you, and you can see the top of the house on the right-hand side. As Repton said, already perfect. And just to complete the story, what happened after 1830? Sarah Elizabeth married Sir John Hay Williams, a Welsh gentleman who built her a fairy tale French chateau in Anglesey. William Pitt Amherst, her younger brother, and eventually the second Earl, remained at Montreal. Sarah, her mother, died in 1838, and her father remarried. He married Mary Sackville of Knowle. She was the widow of other Archer, Windsor, 6th Earl of Plymouth, who was also Lord Amherst's stepson. Unusual, but legal. Anyway, the Earl went to live at Knowle, taking his pheasants with him, hence the origin of the name of the Pheasant Court at Knowle. And Repton's garden, as interpreted by the Amherst family, it lasted 100 years and was finally destroyed in 1838 to make way for a housing estate. Everything has changed apart from the view of the North Downs. The garden is gone, the house is gone. But now we do have a paper trail, and with a little imagination, we have a picture of what has been lost. And all that, and the other sites in Kent, are contained in this book. Thank you very much.